In 1846, a Jewish girl named Scheindla was born into a family of smugglers in the Polish marshlands. By age 20, she had abandoned her arranged marriage, stolen her husband's money, and reinvented herself as Sophia, a multilingual con artist who had become the most famous thief in Russian imperial history. For 40 years, Sonya Golden Hand robbed the wealthiest nobles across Europe, never once using violence, training monkeys to steal jewelry, drugging champagne at casinos, and escaping from Siberian prisons not once, but 3 times. She dressed as countesses to ride first-class trains, as doctors to drug German merchants, and as generals' wives to infiltrate high society balls. Police across Europe knew her name, but couldn't catch her. She changed appearance and identity daily. When finally captured and sent to Sakhalin Island, the harshest prison in the Russian Empire, the famous writer Anton Chekhov met her and wrote, "An old woman who doesn't look like a great criminal." She died in 1902. Or did she? Rumors swirled of escapes to America, sightings in Europe, a mysterious grave that Russian gamblers still visit for luck. This is the true story of the woman who stole millions without ever hurting anyone. The year 1846 brought bitter cold to the Polish wetlands, a region of endless marshes, hidden smuggling routes, and communities that survived by evading the laws of empires that claimed to rule them. Into this world of secrets and survival was born Scheindla Sura Solomoniak, a Jewish girl whose childhood would teach her the skills that would make her a legend. The Solomoniak family weren't ordinary merchants, but smugglers, operating in the complex borderlands between the Russian Empire, Prussia, and Austria. These were territories where official borders meant little, and where clever people could profit by moving goods illegally between jurisdictions. The family business required constant deception, quick thinking, and the ability to talk your way out of trouble. Skills that young Scheindla absorbed like breathing. Her childhood was unusual for a girl of her time and place. While most Jewish girls in 19th century Poland received minimal education focused on domestic skills, Scheindla grew up in a household where knowledge of languages meant profit and survival. The family dealt with Russians, Germans, Poles, and others, requiring facility in multiple languages. By her early teens, Scheindla could speak Russian, Polish, German, and French, with varying degrees of fluency. This linguistic ability would prove crucial to her future career. In an era when most people were monolingual and regional accents immediately identified origins and class, someone who could speak multiple languages convincingly and adopt different personas had enormous advantages. Scheindla learned early that who you appeared to be mattered more than who you actually were. The smuggling life also taught her about corruption, bribery, and the gap between law and practice. She saw officials who could be bought, borders that existed on maps but could be crossed with the right payment, and systems that claimed to enforce rules but actually ran on money and connections. These lessons about how the world really worked would shape her entire approach to crime. But traditional Jewish life in Poland also meant limited options for women. Marriages were arranged, wives were expected to be obedient and domestic, and a woman's choices were severely constrained. As Scheindla entered her late teens, her family arranged a marriage for her, a conventional match with a local Jewish man that would have locked her into a conventional life. The marriage took place, but it didn't last. Accounts vary on exactly what happened, but the basic story is consistent. Shortly after the wedding, Scheindla stole money from her new husband and fled. Some versions say she took his business capital, others that she simply grabbed whatever cash was available. Either way, she made a deliberate choice to abandon the life that had been planned for her and strike out on her own. This decision was extraordinarily bold and dangerous for a young Jewish woman in the 1860s. She had no money beyond what she'd stolen, no connections outside her community, no legitimate way to earn a living, and no protection in a world hostile to lone women. But she also had intelligence, linguistic skills, attractive appearance, and absolute determination not to live the constrained life society expected of her. She made her way to larger cities, first perhaps to Warsaw, then to other urban centers where a woman alone could disappear into crowds and reinvent herself. At some point during these travels, Shaindla Sura Solomoniak became Sofia, adopting a Russian name that sounded more cosmopolitan and less ethnically marked. She learned to dress fashionably, rather than in traditional Jewish clothing, to carry herself with confidence, and to use her appearance as a tool. The exact timeline of her transformation from abandoned wife to professional criminal is unclear, but by her early 20s, Sofia had discovered her vocation. Theft through deception rather than force, targeting the wealthy and powerful rather than the vulnerable, and using intelligence and performance rather than violence. She was creating the persona that would become legendary, Sonya Golden Hand. The nickname Golden Hand, in Russian Zolotaya Ruchka, would be bestowed on her later, but it perfectly captured her method. Her hand was golden because she stole gold and jewels, because she had a gift for the work, and because everything she touched seemed to turn to gold for herself, while vanishing from others. She was building a criminal career that would span 4 decades and multiple countries, a career that would make her famous across Europe. St. Petersburg in the 1870s was the capital of the Russian Empire, a glittering city of palaces and poverty, where aristocrats lived in splendor while masses struggled in tenements. Into this divided world came Sofia, now calling herself Sonya, ready to exploit the gaps between rich and poor, official and unofficial, appearance and reality. Her philosophy of theft was straightforward: steal only from those who could afford the loss, never from the poor or struggling. This wasn't just morality, but practical calculation. Robbing wealthy nobles and merchants meant larger scores, less public sympathy for victims, and police who might not investigate as vigorously as they would crimes against ordinary people. Sonya positioned herself as a Robin Hood figure, though she kept the money rather than giving it away. Her signature technique became known as the Guten Morgen method, good morning in German. She would check into luxury hotels frequented by wealthy travelers, identify targets through careful observation and conversation, and then strike just before dawn, when sleep was deepest and awareness lowest. She would enter their rooms, picked locks were one of her many skills, and carefully remove jewelry, cash, and valuables while the victims slept feet away. The daring of this approach was remarkable. Most thieves preferred to work when properties were empty, minimizing risk of confrontation. Sonya deliberately worked when victims were present, relying on stealth, nerve, and the deep sleep of early morning to avoid detection. When she was successful, victims wouldn't discover the theft until they woke hours later, giving her time to disappear. Her tools were simple but effective. She wore long, voluminous skirts with hidden pockets where stolen items could be concealed. Her shoes had special, soundless soles that allowed her to move silently across hotel corridors and rooms. She carried lockpicks disguised as hairpins or jewelry. Everything about her appearance was calculated to seem innocent while facilitating crime. But her greatest tool was her ability to blend into high society through performance and costume. She would arrive at hotels dressed expensively, speaking perfect French or German, carrying herself with the confidence of nobility. Hotel staff and other guests would assume she belonged in these exclusive spaces because she looked and acted like she did. This confidence trick, seeming to be what you wanted others to believe, was central to all her work. She developed networks of accomplices and informants. Hotel staff could be bribed to provide information about wealthy guests, their room numbers, their routines. Jewelers' assistants might tip her off about major purchases. Fellow criminals could help fence stolen goods or provide false papers. Sonya was building an infrastructure to support her operations across multiple cities. Police found her extraordinarily difficult to catch because she constantly changed appearance and identity. She might be a blonde Russian countess one week, a brunette German widow the next, a red-haired Polish businesswoman after that. She used wigs, makeup, different styles of dress, and different mannerisms to create distinct personas that seemed like completely different people. She also moved frequently between cities, never staying long enough for patterns to emerge or for local police to build a profile of her operations. She would work St. Petersburg for a few months, then disappear to Moscow or Warsaw or Kiev, then return months later looking and acting completely differently. This mobility made her a nightmare for 19th-century law enforcement that relied on local knowledge and couldn't easily share information across jurisdictions. Her reputation began to spread through newspapers and police reports. Stories about the mysterious woman thief who robbed nobles became popular reading. Some reports were accurate, others wildly exaggerated, but all contributed to the legend of Sonya Golden Hand. The name itself became known. Police and criminals alike recognized it, though few could say what she actually looked like. As Sonya's skills and confidence grew, so did the audacity and complexity of her schemes. She wasn't content with simple hotel room theft, but developed elaborate cons that combined theater, psychology, and timing. One of her favorite techniques involved traveling on first-class railway carriages, dressed as a wealthy noblewoman. She would strike up conversations with fellow first-class passengers, wealthy merchants, aristocrats, military officers, and create situations where she appeared to be the victim of theft herself. She would discover her purse missing and become distraught, appealing to the chivalry of male passengers who would offer help, money, and sympathy. Of course, her purse hadn't been stolen. She'd hidden it herself, but the performance allowed her to gather information about the real wealth of her targets, and sometimes to pickpocket them while they were focused on helping her. Perhaps her most famous scheme involved training a small monkey to steal jewelry from shop windows. The story, which may be partly legendary but was widely reported, described how Sonya would dress elegantly and visit high-end jewelry stores, bringing her pet monkey. While she distracted staff with questions and conversation, the trained monkey would grab small, valuable items and hide them. When Sonya left, the stolen goods went with her. The audacity of using an animal accomplice captured public imagination and added to her legend. She created entire fictional identities, complete with backstories, documents, and props. She would pose as the wife of a general, complete with forged papers and military knowledge gained from careful research. This persona allowed her to attend exclusive social events and military gatherings where wealthy officers might be relieved of their valuables, or where she could gather intelligence for future operations. Her connection to the criminal underworld included association with a group called the Club of Hearts of Knaves, a semi-legendary organization of sophisticated criminals who supposedly operated across the Russian Empire. Whether this organization actually existed as described or was partly mythologized is unclear, but Sonya's connection to it enhanced her reputation as part of an elite criminal class, rather than a common thief. Despite the criminal nature of her activities, she maintained a personal code of conduct that distinguished her from violent criminals. She never carried weapons, never threatened anyone, never used force. If a scheme went wrong and confrontation seemed likely, she would flee rather than fight. This non-violent approach was partly practical. A charge of robbery with violence carried much harsher penalties than simple theft. But it also seemed to reflect genuine principles. Stories about her cleverness and daring spread through criminal networks and police departments alike. There was the time she supposedly drugged champagne at a Swiss casino and robbed unconscious gamblers. The elaborate scheme in Leipzig, where she posed as a female doctor to gain access to a wealthy merchant's home. The incident in Berlin, where she switched identities with another woman mid-con to confuse pursuing police. Some of these stories were undoubtedly exaggerated or fabricated, but they built her legend. She became a figure of fascination, a woman who had escaped conventional roles and lived by her wits, who robbed the rich but harmed no one, who was clever enough to outwit police across multiple countries. In an era with limited entertainment and celebrity culture, Sonya Goldenhand became a star. Newspapers published accounts of her exploits with a mix of condemnation and admiration. The respectable press denounced her as a criminal, but readers couldn't help being impressed by her audacity and skill. She represented something appealing: freedom from convention, intelligence rewarded, the powerful brought low by a clever woman. She was living a life of adventure that most people, especially women, could never dream of attempting. But legends are fragile, and the same boldness that made her successful would eventually contribute to her downfall. As her fame grew, so did police determination to catch her, and her personal life, which she had largely kept separate from her criminal career, was about to create vulnerability that her enemies could exploit. By the late 1870s and early 1880s, Sonya had expanded her operations beyond the Russian Empire into Western Europe. The great cities of Vienna, Berlin, Paris, and others beckoned with their wealthy residents, luxury hotels, and opportunities for a skilled thief who could navigate multiple languages and cultures. Vienna, capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was a particular favorite. The city's grand hotels housed traveling nobility and wealthy merchants from across Europe. Sonya would check in under false names, observe routines, identify targets, and strike with her characteristic precision. She became known to Viennese police, who circulated descriptions of her, though the descriptions varied wildly since she constantly changed her appearance. In Leipzig, Germany, she pulled off one of her most audacious schemes by posing as a female physician. In an era when female doctors were rare and often viewed with suspicion, Sonya's confident performance convinced a wealthy merchant's household to admit her to treat a supposed illness. Once inside, she had access to the family's valuables and left with a substantial haul before anyone realized she wasn't a real doctor. Her use of drugs became more sophisticated. She would slip sedatives into drinks at social gatherings, casinos, or private meetings. The victims would fall into deep sleep, and Sonya would rob them leisurely before disappearing. She reportedly used a particular drug dissolved in champagne that was colorless, tasteless, and produced sleep within minutes. Perhaps chloral hydrate, a common sedative of the era that was, unfortunately, also used by criminals. The early Interpol, or rather the precursor organizations that would eventually become Interpol, began sharing information about her across European police departments. But communication in the 1880s was slow, descriptions were unreliable, and Sonya stayed ahead by moving frequently and changing identities. By the time police in one city had built a file on her, she was already in another country, operating under a different name. Her fame grew through newspaper coverage. Journalists loved writing about the mysterious woman criminal who outwitted police and stole from the rich. Some articles were sensationalized, adding fictional elements to real events. Others were surprisingly accurate, based on police reports or interviews with victims. Either way, Sonya Goldenhand became a household name across Europe, a celebrity criminal known from St. Petersburg to Paris. She lived well on her proceeds, staying in fine hotels, dining in expensive restaurants, gambling in casinos. In Switzerland and France, she frequented gambling establishments where wealthy Russians and other nobles lost fortunes at cards and roulette. Sometimes she gambled legitimately with stolen money. Other times, she used casinos as hunting grounds, identifying wealthy marks and following them to rob them later. Her lifestyle was glamorous but precarious. She spent money as fast as she stole it, maintaining the expensive appearance and habits necessary to blend with high society. She had no legitimate income, no savings she could access without revealing her criminal activity, no security beyond her wits and skills. She was always one step ahead of disaster, or one mistake away from capture. The contradiction of her life was striking. She lived among the wealthy, dressed like them, spoke like them, and moved through their world with apparent ease. But she was fundamentally an outsider, a criminal who would be destroyed if they discovered her true nature. The performance was exhausting and constant, requiring perfect discipline and awareness at all times. Yet for nearly 2 decades, she maintained this impossible balancing act, stealing millions in valuables, evading police across multiple countries, and building a legend that would outlive her. But the very fame that made her a celebrity also made her a priority target for law enforcement. And her personal life, which she had kept carefully separate from her professional activities, was about to create the vulnerability that would lead to her first capture. In the mid-1880s, Sonya met Wolf Bromberg, a young criminal who specialized in gambling fraud and con games. He was handsome, charming, and reckless, everything that should have warned her away. But Sonya, who had spent decades trusting no one and maintaining emotional distance from everyone around her, fell deeply in love. Wolf was perhaps 20 years younger than Sonya, who was now in her late 30s or early 40s. The age difference didn't matter to her. She had spent her life defying social conventions, and loving a younger man was a minor transgression compared to her career. What mattered was that for the first time, she had found someone who seemed to understand her, who accepted her criminal life, who promised partnership rather than judgment. But Wolf saw Sonya differently than she saw him. Where she saw love and partnership, he saw opportunity. Sonya had money, connections, and skills. Wolf had ambition, debt, and a gambling habit he couldn't control. He began using her resources for his own schemes, borrowing money that he lost at cards, involving her in increasingly risky operations that served his interests rather than their mutual benefit. Sonya's judgment, usually sharp and calculating, became clouded by emotion. She trusted Wolf in ways she had never trusted anyone, sharing information about her methods, her contacts, her planned operations. She let him into her life completely, abandoning the careful compartmentalization that had protected her for decades. The relationship changed her behavior in dangerous ways. She took risks she would normally avoid, attempting larger and more ambitious thefts to fund Wolf's gambling and lifestyle. She stayed in cities longer than was safe because Wolf wanted to remain. She confided in him about past crimes and future plans, giving him knowledge that could destroy her if he chose to use it. Wolf's betrayal, when it came, was total and devastating. Exactly what happened varies across different accounts, but the essential story is that Wolf, facing gambling debts or perhaps arrested himself, traded information about Sonya to the police in exchange for leniency or payment. He told them who she was, where she was staying, and details of a major theft she was planning. Some versions suggest he did this reluctantly, forced by circumstances. Others portray him as coldly calculating, having used her from the beginning. Regardless of motivation, the result was the same. The man Sonya loved and trusted completely betrayed her to authorities, ending her freedom and nearly ending her life. The planned theft that Wolf revealed to police was to be one of Sonya's most ambitious, a major score that would have set her up financially for years. Instead, it became a trap. When she arrived at the target location in Moscow in 1888, police were waiting. After decades of evading capture, Sonya Golden Hand was finally arrested. The arrest shocked the Russian Empire and made headlines across Europe. The legendary Sonya Golden Hand, who had evaded police for 20 years and stolen millions, had been caught. Newspapers published details of her career, her methods, and the betrayal by her lover. The public, which had followed her exploits with fascinated attention, now watched to see what would happen to her. Sonya was devastated emotionally as well as professionally. The betrayal by Wolf hurt more than the arrest. She had survived poverty, isolation, constant danger, and narrow escapes. But she had never been truly betrayed by someone she loved. That emotional wound, combined with the practical disaster of capture, represented a catastrophic collapse of the life she had built. But even in custody, facing serious criminal charges and likely imprisonment, Sonya remained herself, clever, defiant, and determined to survive. Her next chapter would be written in courtrooms and prisons, but the story was far from over. The trial of Sonya Golden Hand in Moscow in 1889 was a sensation. The courtroom was packed with spectators, eager to see the famous criminal in person. Newspapers sent reporters to cover every detail. The public gallery was filled with a mix of society ladies, curious about the woman who had robbed their peers, and ordinary citizens, fascinated by celebrity. Sonya's appearance surprised many. Observers had expected a hard, masculine woman, or a seductive femme fatale. Instead, they saw a middle-aged woman of unremarkable appearance, dressed simply, who seemed like a respectable merchant's wife rather than a notorious criminal. This ordinariness was itself remarkable. It demonstrated how she had hidden in plain sight for so long. But when she spoke, her true nature emerged. Sonya defended herself with wit and intelligence, challenging prosecution witnesses, pointing out inconsistencies in evidence, and refusing to show the expected contrition. When prosecutors described her crimes, she corrected their facts. Yes, she had stolen these items, but the value was exaggerated. Yes, she had used that method, but the description was inaccurate. Her verbal sparring with prosecutors and judges became legendary. She was articulate, quick-thinking, and unintimidated by the courtroom setting. At one point, when the prosecutor called her a danger to society, she reportedly replied that she was less dangerous than the corrupt officials who took bribes while pretending to uphold the law. The gallery erupted in laughter, and the judge threatened to clear the courtroom. But wit couldn't save her from the evidence. Her crimes were well documented, witnesses were credible, and stolen property had been recovered. She was convicted on multiple counts of theft and fraud and sentenced to hard labor in Siberia, a punishment that many didn't survive. For a woman in her 40s, accustomed to comfortable living, Siberian exile was effectively a death sentence. She was transported to Siberia with other convicts, a journey of thousands of miles in brutal conditions. Upon arrival, she was assigned to labor in mines or factories, work that was physically destroying for hardened men and nearly impossible for a middle-aged woman. The guards were brutal, the conditions inhuman, the food inadequate. Most prisoners lasted only a few years before dying of disease, exhaustion, or despair. But Sonya had not survived 40 years as a criminal by accepting her fate passively. Almost immediately, she began planning escape. She used the same skills that had made her a successful thief: observation, patience, building relationships, finding weaknesses in systems. She befriended guards, other prisoners, and civilian workers at the prison, gradually assembling information and resources. The details of her first escape vary across sources, but the basic story is that she managed to seduce or bribe a guard who helped her flee. Some versions say she pretended to be seriously ill and was taken to a hospital from which she escaped. Others claim she simply walked out, dressed as a guard or civilian worker, her acting skills allowing her to pass as someone who belonged. Whatever the method, she successfully escaped and made her way across Siberia, a journey of incredible difficulty through thousands of miles of wilderness, evading pursuit, finding food and shelter, and eventually reaching European Russia. The escape itself became legendary, adding to her mystique as someone who couldn't be contained. She resumed her criminal career under new identities, lying low initially, but gradually returning to the methods that had served her well. But she had been gone from the criminal underworld for months or years, and things had changed. Police were more organized, photography was making it harder to change identities completely, and her own fame worked against her. Too many people knew who Sonya Goldenhand was. Sonya's freedom after her first escape lasted only a few years. By 1888, she was arrested again. Some sources say she was betrayed again, others that police finally caught up with her through improved investigative methods. This time, authorities took no chances. She was sentenced to exile on Sakhalin Island, the most feared prison in the Russian Empire. Sakhalin Island lies off the eastern coast of Siberia, separated from the mainland by freezing waters. In the late 19th century, it was Russia's most remote and harsh penal colony, reserved for the most dangerous criminals and political prisoners considered too threatening to keep in mainland prisons. Conditions were deliberately brutal, designed to break prisoners physically and psychologically. Sonya arrived at Sakhalin in chains. Prison officials, aware of her escape history, took special precautions. She was kept in heavy shackles that she wore continuously, even while sleeping. The shackles prevented running and made escape attempts nearly impossible. They were also physically agonizing over time, causing sores, infections, and permanent damage to ankles and wrists. Her life on Sakhalin was a nightmare of hard labor, inadequate food, disease, and despair. She worked in brutal conditions, slept in overcrowded barracks, and lived under constant surveillance. For a woman who had spent her adult life in freedom, luxury, and adventure, the transition to prison hell was devastating. In 1890, she had an unexpected visitor. Anton Chekhov, the famous Russian writer, came to Sakhalin to document prison conditions. Chekhov was conducting a comprehensive census of the island's prisoners and writing a book that would expose the horrors of the penal system. During his work, he interviewed many prisoners, including Sonya. Chekhov's description of his encounter with Sonya Goldenhand was brief but memorable. He wrote that she was an old woman who doesn't look like a great criminal. This simple observation captured something important: Sonya's ordinariness, the way her appearance belied her extraordinary life. Chekhov's report also noted that she was among the prisoners kept in permanent shackles due to escape risk. But even Sakhalin couldn't completely contain Sonya. According to some accounts, she attempted escape at least 3 times from the island. The first 2 attempts failed. She was caught and punished severely, possibly with solitary confinement, reduced rations, or beatings. Prison records from Sakhalin are incomplete, so the exact details of these escape attempts aren't well documented. The third attempt's outcome is disputed. Some sources claim she was caught again and returned to even harsher conditions. Others suggest she might have succeeded in escaping from the island, but was recaptured on the mainland. The confusion about what exactly happened illustrates how difficult it is to separate fact from legend in Sonya's story. What's certain is that her time on Sakhalin was marked by physical and psychological torture. The heavy shackles she wore caused chronic pain and injury. The hard labor destroyed her health. The isolation and brutality of prison life wore down even her formidable spirit. By the early 1890s, after years on Sakhalin, Sonya was a shadow of the confident, energetic woman who had once robbed nobles across Europe. The conditions on Sakhalin were so horrific that Chekhov's book about the island helped spark prison reform movements in Russia. But reform came too late for many prisoners, including possibly Sonya. Her health deteriorated severely from the combination of age, hard labor, inadequate food, disease, and the physical damage from years of wearing heavy chains. Official records state that Sonya Goldenhand died on Sakhalin Island in 1902 of pneumonia. She would have been approximately 56 years old, though exact birth dates from that era are often uncertain. After more than a decade in one of the world's harshest prisons, her death from respiratory disease would be completely unsurprising and sadly typical. Her body was supposedly buried in the prison cemetery on Sakhalin, in an unmarked grave like those of hundreds of other prisoners who died there. The cemetery was a grim place, of rough wooden crosses that quickly rotted in the harsh climate, leaving no permanent markers. Within years, individual graves became indistinguishable, and the dead were forgotten. But even in death, Sonya generated controversy and legend. Almost immediately after reports of her death circulated, rumors began that she had actually escaped and faked her death. Some stories claimed she had bribed officials to declare her dead, while she secretly left the island. Others suggested she had escaped to America and lived out her years in New York or San Francisco under a new identity. These escape stories were fueled partly by Sonya's history. She had escaped from Siberian exile before, so why not again? They were also fueled by desire. The public that had followed her adventures for decades didn't want her story to end with a miserable death in a prison cemetery. They wanted her to have one final triumph, one last escape, a happy ending to an extraordinary life. Some of these stories were surprisingly specific. A woman appeared in Europe in the 1900s claiming to be Sonya Goldenhand, living in comfortable retirement on the proceeds of a hidden fortune. The claim was never proven, but it was never definitively disproven either. Without photographs or fingerprints, neither was standard in that era, identifying someone decades after they'd last been seen publicly was nearly impossible. Meanwhile, in Moscow's Vagankovo cemetery, a mysterious grave appeared that became associated with Sonya's memory. The grave supposedly belonged to her, though how her body would have been transported from Sakhalin to Moscow was never explained. The grave became a pilgrimage site for Russian criminals and gamblers. According to tradition, criminals and gamblers would visit this grave before major crimes or gambling sessions, leaving offerings and asking for golden hands blessing for luck and success. The ritual became so established that police monitored the grave, sometimes arresting people who visited it. This tradition continued through the Soviet era and even into modern times, testament to the enduring power of Sonya's legend. Adding to the mystery, records suggest that Sonya had two daughters who became actresses or performers. What happened to them is unclear. Sources conflict about their names, careers, and fates. Some suggest they died young, others that they deliberately hid their connection to their infamous mother and lived normal lives under different names. The disappearance of her children from the historical record adds another layer of mystery to her story. The lack of definitive information about Sonya's death and what happened afterward is frustrating for historians, but perfect for legend-making. The ambiguity allows people to believe what they want, that she died miserably in prison, or that she escaped one final time and lived in freedom, or that she's buried in Moscow, where criminals still honor her memory. What's certain is that whether she died on Sakhalin in 1902 or lived longer elsewhere, she eventually died. But the legend of Sonya Golden Hand didn't die with her. Instead, it grew, spreading through criminal culture, literature, and eventually popular media, ensuring that her story would be told for more than a century after her death. In Russian criminal culture, Sonya Golden Hand occupies a unique position. She's remembered not with fear, but with admiration, even affection. She became a folk hero, the Robin Hood of Russian thieves, though unlike Robin Hood, she kept the money for herself rather than giving it to the poor. What made her admirable to both criminals and the general public was her method. She never used violence, never hurt anyone physically, never threatened or intimidated. In an era when many criminals were brutal, when robbery often meant beatings or worse, Sonya's nonviolent approach seemed almost genteel. She robbed people, yes, but she did it through cleverness rather than force. This distinction mattered psychologically and morally. Theft of property, especially from the wealthy, could be rationalized or even celebrated. Violence against persons crossed a line that made someone genuinely frightening rather than romantically daring. Sonya stayed on the acceptable side of that line throughout her career, and it shaped how she was remembered. Psychologists and criminologists have analyzed what made Sonya's non-violent approach possible. Part of it was practical. She was a woman operating in an era when women weren't expected to be physically dangerous, which gave her advantages in approaching targets and deflecting suspicion. Part was temperamental. She apparently lacked the aggression that drives violent crime. And part was moral. She seems to have genuinely believed that stealing was acceptable, but harming people was not. Her career had unexpected effects on criminal justice and security practices. Banks and hotels began implementing better security measures in response to crimes like hers. The use of safes improved, door locks became more sophisticated, and staff training emphasized vigilance against con artists and thieves. In a real sense, Sonya's success drove innovation in security technology. Her story also reflected the position of women in Imperial Russian society. She was, in many ways, a feminist figure avant la lettre, a woman who rejected the constrained roles society offered, who lived independently, who used her intelligence to succeed in a male-dominated world. She couldn't do this through legitimate means. Society didn't offer women paths to independence and wealth through legal channels, so she did it through crime. This gendered reading of her story has made her increasingly interesting to modern audiences. She wasn't just a criminal. She was a woman fighting against the limitations placed on her by a patriarchal society. Her crimes were a form of rebellion against a system that would have confined her to domesticity and subordination. This interpretation may romanticize her life, but it contains truth about the limited options available to women of her era. She became a character in literature, plays, and eventually films. Russian and Soviet writers created fictionalized versions of her story, sometimes staying close to known facts, sometimes inventing wildly. These cultural representations kept her memory alive and introduced her to new generations who wouldn't otherwise know about a 19th century criminal. The lessons people drew from her story varied. For some, she demonstrated that cleverness and courage could overcome social limitations. For others, she showed that crime, however clever, ultimately led to suffering and imprisonment. For still others, she was simply entertainment, a fascinating character whose life read like adventure fiction. Her influence on popular culture extended beyond Russia. As her story became known internationally, she inspired characters in Western literature and film. The gentleman thief, the charming con artist, the criminal with a code of ethics. While she wasn't the only or first such figure, she was among the most famous real-life examples of the type. The enduring fascination with Sonya Golden Hand says something about what people value in storytelling. Cleverness over force, courage over conformity, individual agency over social control, and complexity over simple moral categories. She was a criminal, yes, but an interesting one whose story raises questions about justice, gender, society, and the nature of wrongdoing that remain relevant more than a century later. Separating fact from fiction in Sonya's story requires examining multiple sources and recognizing that much of what's known about her comes from sources with varying reliability. Police records, newspaper accounts, criminal folklore, and later literary elaborations. The most reliable sources are official documents, arrest records, trial transcripts, prison registers, and police reports from the Tsarist era. These confirm the basic outline of her life. She was a real person, she was arrested multiple times, she was convicted of theft, she was sent to Sakhalin. These documents provide dates, locations, and factual details that anchor the story in reality. Newspaper coverage from the 1880s to 1900s is voluminous, but must be read critically. Newspapers of that era often sensationalized criminal cases, adding invented dialogue and fictional details to make stories more entertaining. Some accounts of Sonya's exploits are probably accurate, others are exaggerated, and some are likely complete fabrications. Sorting them out requires cross-referencing multiple sources and applying skeptical judgment. Photographs present particular challenges. A few images claimed to be of Sonya exist, but authentication is difficult. Photography in the 1800s wasn't as widespread as today, and most criminals weren't systematically photographed. The images that do exist might be genuine, might be of other people incorrectly identified as Sonya, or might be deliberate forgeries created to meet public demand for images of the famous criminal. Prison records from Sakhalin, while incomplete, do document a woman matching Sonya's description being held there in the 1890s to 1900s. Anton Chekhov's mention of her in his Sakhalin writings is particularly valuable as independent confirmation from a credible source who had no reason to invent or embellish her presence. The gap between legend and reality is perhaps widest regarding specific crimes and methods. Some of the most famous stories, the trained monkey stealing jewelry, the elaborate drugging schemes, the multiple escape attempts, are attested in only a single source, or in sources that might have copied from each other. They might be true, might be exaggerated, or might be complete inventions. Modern podcast and YouTube culture has renewed interest in Sonya's story, introducing her to audiences who had never heard of her. English-language content about her has proliferated, often drawing from Russian sources, but sometimes adding additional layers of interpretation or speculation. This content varies widely in historical rigor. Some creators carefully cite sources and acknowledge uncertainties, others present speculation as fact. The story appeals to international audiences, particularly in the UK, USA, Germany, and other European countries, for several reasons. There's the universal appeal of a clever criminal story. There's specific interest in Imperial Russian history and culture. There's fascination with women who defied gender expectations. And there's the mystery element, the unanswered questions about what's true and what's legend. The historical connections matter too. Sonya operated across Europe, robbing people in Germany, Austria, France, and elsewhere, not just in Russia. She's part of a shared European criminal history, not just a Russian phenomenon. Her story connects to broader themes in 19th century European history: class inequality, the position of women, the development of police and detective work, the romanticization of criminals. The final question Sonya's story raises is moral and philosophical. Was she a criminal deserving punishment, or a victim of an unjust society who did what she needed to survive and thrive? The answer depends partly on values: how much you weight property rights versus individual freedom, how much you factor in the limited options available to women, how much you credit her non-violence in a violent era. Most balanced assessments conclude she was both. a criminal by any reasonable definition, but also someone shaped by circumstances, who made choices within very limited options. She stole from people who could afford the loss, never physically harmed anyone, and lived with remarkable independence and courage in an era that denied both to women. Her life was filled with deception, yes, but also with freedom. Freedom from convention, from subordination, from the narrow roles society prescribed. Whether that freedom justified the means she used to achieve it remains an open question. But it's undeniable that she lived on her own terms in an era when few women could say the same. Sonya Goldenhand died more than a century ago, but her story persists because it speaks to something timeless. The tension between rules and freedom, between social expectations and individual desires, between the life you're given and the life you choose to take. She chose to take, literally and metaphorically, and paid the price. But she lived free in ways that millions of her contemporaries never could. Whether that makes her a hero, a villain, or something more complex, is a question each person must answer for themselves.